Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sally Cook, a certified floodplain manager, education director for the Florida Floodplain Managers Association, and your moderator for this session, Floodplain Management Compliance. One quick reminder, when you have a question, please type it in right away. Let's take a minute to thank Forerunner, our session sponsor, and watch a short message.
Forerunner is the floodplain management platform for resilient communities. Our web-based software is built for local government and delivers actionable property-level flood risk information to users. We streamline floodplain management by combining FEMA and local data sets, enable compliance with custom flood warnings, and accelerate outreach through features like resident logs and white-labeled flood information website for resident education. We help ensure that permitting goes smoothly with our EC error detection feature, which runs over 100 validation checks on each elevation certificate. Our customers also use our substantial improvement and substantial damage tracker to make sure that construction is well documented for the CRS. Forerunner has worked with communities like Harris County, Texas, and Jefferson Parish, Louisiana. Our software has saved communities across the country thousands of staff hours. To learn more and to request a free pilot, please go to www.withforerunner.com.
Thank you, Forerunner, for supporting the ASFPM 2021 conference and this session. Our first presentation is a fresh look at community compliance with the National Flood Insurance Program with Sarah Owen. Here she is to introduce herself. Go ahead, Sarah.
Hello, my name is Sarah Owen. I work at FEMA headquarters in the Floodplain Management Division. I used to work in Region 9 in floodplain management and insurance doing compliance, and now I'm providing rules and tools to help the regions do compliance and helping to write policy from headquarters. And I want to talk to you today about the NFIP compliance redesign effort and what that means. But first, I do want to acknowledge that I might have some construction noise in the back of me during this recording. What are you going to do? We'll just, I'll speak loudly and we'll make sure that you can hear me clearly. So the things that I want to talk to you about today is explain to you why the need for NFIP compliance redesign exists. Why are we doing this? And I'm going to talk to you about how we're reimagining the CAV, Community Assistance Visit, and the CAC, the Community Assistance Contact. And I'm going to talk to you about some of the key features of the enhanced compliance audit process. Then I have some questions for you. And then I'll take your questions in the final Q&A answer session. So I don't need to preach to the choir, but I'm going to anyway. We know that mitigation works. We know it saves money. We know that something as simple as building to the minimum NFIP requirements saves money. How much does it save? It saves $100 billion over the last 40 years of FEMA. We know that on a yearly basis, year to year, we're saving the nation $2.4 billion. And we know that structures that are permitted and built in compliance with the minimum NFIP standards incur 65% less flood damage than other buildings that are not. And we know that mitigation is very important to save money, taxpayer money, when we do declare a disaster and the disaster funds open up. That's not just money out of the blue, that's taxpayer money that we're saving when we build in compliance. We're saving communities' livelihoods, we're saving businesses, homes, schools, places of worship, businesses. We're saving all these things and maintaining the local community tax base when we build just at the minimum NFIP requirements. And we know that in order to get people to build to the requirements, we conduct audits, we conduct CAVs and CACs, or assessments for compliance. So how things stand right now today, we have over 22,000 communities participating in the NFIP. And at any given time, we only know the compliance for 33% of them. That's not a number that that I feel super proud of, and it certainly leaves room for improvement. And our goal, eventually, our pie in the sky goal would be to have 100% known compliance for every community that participates in the NFIP on any given day. But in the near term, we have a goal of basically doubling what we're doing now. So in the next few years, what we're aiming for is 67% known compliance of all of the 22,000 plus NFIP communities. So how do we accomplish this? We're trying to reimagine and redesign and build a new audit assessment process. We're trying to find efficiencies. We're trying to find best practices. We're trying to re-examine the way we normally do business so that we can reach that goal. We need to be doing better than 33% of known compliance. Over the past year and a half, the Compliance Committee, which is comprised of subject matter experts from all of the regions and is headed by me and Jeff Hurd, the Region 8 Branch Chief for FMNI. We've been discussing key challenges that we face in CAVs and CACs today. And we've been discussing root causes, and we've been trying to figure out how we can mitigate those challenges and issues. We've also talked to other government officials and other industry experts who do audits, namely, food safety audits, airplane audits. This is all for safety, right? And our program is a safety program as well. And when we do audits, we're auditing for safety. So we've been talking to other agencies and other corporate people to see how is it that they do their audits, and how do they assess for compliance? How do they assess for safety? And we're exploring potential solutions, including combining the CAV and CAC into one continuous audit process. It's like a spectrum, like a continuum. Instead of quantized CAC or CAV, we will have a lighter assessment with certain depth that we go. And then if we find issues there, we'll go more in depth. And if we find issues more in depth. So it's really a continuum. It's all assessment, but some communities lend themselves to a light assessment. We know they're doing well, or they don't have a lot of risk, or they don't have a lot of potential development. So we can refocus our energies on the communities that need more of an in-depth assessment and need more of our help. And we're redesigning the CAV-CAC to focus on enhanced audit capabilities. And in specific, we're also decoupling audit and technical assistance. It's the same thing we've always been doing. We'll still be assessing and helping, but at the end of the assessment, we'll get a grade. The community will have a grade. And from that grade forward, you may have to give them technical assistance, which again is what we're already doing anyway. But some of the things that we were considering is to have a community self-assessment be part of that process. Of course, we're not going to rely on just a self-assessment. We'll have follow-up questions, and we'll have different available data. If it's our SEP tool or IA data or Zillow or other things online, we're looking to assess things from the data that we have and the interview process. And we're going to increase our efficiency, consistency, and transparency of how we get the grade or the score for compliance. And we're going to update the CAV and CAC manual when we get this new process decided on. So right now we're just in the ideation stages. We're creating it. We're thinking of it. We have to run it by internal standards, and we'll run it by the states and get state feedback. It's a long process before this gets finalized, but when it does, it will end up in the CAV-CAC manual, and you'll be trained. We'll have training courses, we'll have job aids, we'll have tools, we'll have guidance documents, we'll have communications materials, all sorts of things to help you understand the new process. So we're using an agile innovation approach to reimagine our CAV-CAC audit process. It's an industry best standard for programmatic development, and it's being done in a virtual environment. As you can see, this is a screenshot of some of the things that we do during a sprint. Again, the committee is made up of regional experts, and we all come together and we focus on problems, and we focus on solutions, and we collaborate on new ideas and how we can change this and how we can improve that and what might be challenges here and there. We also poke holes in things. We try different ideas. We try way out there ideas. We try just tweaking it a little bit ideas, and it's all room for discussion and collaboration, and we build on our failures until we find successes and things that we can all agree on to move that idea forward to the next stage. So I'm going to talk to you about 6 of the features that we have for the enhanced compliance audit process. What we're considering the audit, the end of the audit, the end goal of the audit is to take a snapshot of the compliance of that community, snapshot in time. Of course, it changes the next day and the next year, or if you had done it a week earlier, it might be different, but it's just a snapshot in time, like a grade of the health of the community's NFIP compliance and floodplain management program. It helps us understand when we get that grade, that snapshot in time, that's the end of the audit process. Now we know, do we need to give them a lot of general technical assistance and training? Do we need to work with them a lot? Or can we wrap that up, close the door on that for 5 years and come back and visit them later? One of the things that I mentioned before is we're considering as part of the process is to have a community self-assessment. It's going to help us have a conversation with the communities and whoever's auditing them, if it's FEMA or the state. We'll have data that we've collected that we'll talk to them about, and they'll have assessed themselves on certain things. And it's really not unlike the biennial report, if you remember that from the old days, but it's a lot more targeted and gets to the point a little more about the health of their compliance program. Since the program was enacted, we have so much more data now available to us. And you'll notice in the CAV and CAC manual, we don't talk about the data, different data that we have. We're always coming out with different data and different ways to assess things. So like our SEP tool, IA data, like I said, different publicly available data. Data is so much more available to us and at our fingertips these days. We need to use that better in conducting our compliance audits and documenting our findings. 3 more of the key features of this enhanced compliance audit process are virtual engagement. So I think we've all had a lot of virtual engagement over the last 1.5 years or so. It used to be thought of as a cost savings, and that's a very legitimate reason to do virtual engagements, but sometimes that's all we're allowed to do, like for the last year. And we've been conducting a pilot actually on virtual CAVs to see like, how can this be done? What technologies do you need? Obviously, some communities you're not going to be able to engage virtually, but some communities you will be able to, and that can save resources, that can move things forward even during a global pandemic. But we're definitely trying to figure out more ways of virtual engagement and when it works and when it doesn't. So when to use it and when not to use it. We're also trying to find more consistency with how we apply our audits, how we assess, how we grade. How do we know that this community is in good standing? Well, we're creating a violations and deficiencies data dictionary. It's going to explain most of our common floodplain violations and deficiencies and categorize them so we're all speaking the same language or we're all reading from the same songbook. Yes, I know that some of this is addressed already in the CAV-CAC manuals and in the compliance manual, but we're refining it more, again, for consistency. And another thing that we're talking about doing is creating a national review board. So again, for consistency, to make sure that all the regions are consistently applying the audit process in a similar way, and all the states are, again, consistent with their application of the audit process. And we know sometimes we might get some sticky situations, some complicated or politically charged or new and novel things that come along that we might need a broader discussion about. So we're thinking of creating a board that's what they do. They help us work out any problematic compliance issues and review controversial cases or conduct outreach or again, for more consistency with how we do the audit process. So the redesign of the audit process will result in several things. Number one, we want to reduce the complexity. We know that's in our strategic plan. Yes, we need to reduce the complexity of the things that we do in the federal government. We need to clearly communicate our expectations. We need to be accountable for the decisions that we've made and the grades that we've given. And we need to be transparent. How did we get there? Because right now you have to go into CIS and read this whole narrative and this long thing, and then look over here on this other page to see what was uploaded and whatever. We're trying to make that simpler. So you can just look in one place, see what the grade is, see what the work is that has to be done. And it's just going to be a much better way to communicate and to be transparent. And again, like I said, we're going to take a snapshot in time of the health of the community's compliance program. Does that mean that they're locked there forever? Well, no, of course not. But that's the snapshot in time. And that's where we know how to direct our resources. Do we need to spend a lot of time on this community? Or are we better served putting all those resources on another community that has a lot of risk and a lot of development pressure and a lot of problems? We're going to improve our data collection. So we want to, again, find consistent ways to collect data, consistent ways to talk about data. We want to be able to analyze data. You know, this is the day and age of data analytics. They're doing it all the time for every purpose. And we want to take advantage of that too. We want to be able to compare one community to another community, look for trends nationwide, and we want to look for trends over time. That's what's going to be really great about this process. We'll be able to have a one-stop shop. We'll see, oh, 5 years ago, they were a D, and 2 years ago, they're a B, and now look at them, they're an A. And every time we've engaged them, we're helping them to become more compliant. And again, that's saving money, taxpayers, that's being resilient in our communities. That's all the things that we love about mitigation. And we need to articulate the value of floodplain management. We know intrinsically the value of this because we work with it every day, but we want to be able to promote that. We want to be able to sell that to everybody and get them all excited about being in compliance with the NFIP because it really does protect your community. And we want to support communities. Again, we have limited resources at the state and at FEMA regions, and we have over 22,000 participating communities. So there's no way we could do an in-depth CAV and trainings and hand holdings and relationship buildings for all of those. So we need to find the ones that need us most and devote our resources to them. And in this process, we definitely want to hear from you. So will you please let us know your thoughts? What are the components of the current CAV and CAC process that you think work well? What are the components of the CAV and CAC process that you think could be improved upon? And are there any features of the CAV-CAC process that you don't want to see go away, that you want to make sure we maintain through the redesign? Please let us know. Thank you. Hi, this is Sarah Owen. You just watched a short video about the CAV and CAC redesign process. And before I answer your questions regarding the video that you just saw, I'd like to ask you some questions. So please type it in our chat box, and the contractors will record your answers to this. We want to know your feedback on what you think is working well about CAVs and CACs in our current process. What are some of the things that work well? Maybe you think it's building relationships. Maybe you think it's the CAV report itself has a lot of good information in it. Whatever answer you have to that question, please type it into the chat box so we can record your feedback. And we have another question for you. What do you think about CAVs and CACs, the way we're currently doing them, could be improved upon? Maybe you think we need to do more CAVs and CACs. Maybe you think we need to record them and document them better. Whatever your answer is to that, please write it in the chat, and we'll record this information, your valuable feedback. And then I have one last question for you before I take your questions, and that is, what do we absolutely have to keep about the way we do CAVs and CACs? Like something that we need to make sure we retain during this redesign process. Type it in the chat, please.
And they're starting to do that, Sarah. So thank you, everybody. Put your comments in the chat.
Okay, well, I know some of you are going to keep finishing up that for us, and I thank you for your feedback. We're going to transition right now into me answering your questions. So let me start with, how would this continuous CAV assessment process apply to communities interested in joining CRS? We have not figured out what the status of this will be with CRS, if it will change anything. They're also asking, will the community's grade or compliance grade have a relationship or an impact on CRS rating? We're in the beginning redesign phases, and that is an excellent question that we're writing down and we'll be able to answer later. But at this moment, we don't have the answer to that. It's more of a comment than a question, but someone wrote, glad that FEMA is undertaking the compliance overhaul process. FEMA should strongly consider using CAV data as part of the HMA grant evaluation process. I think that's a great idea, and I can't speak on HMA, but they might be looking into that. You can ask your HNA specialist what's going on with that. How will communities be able to complete an assessment if they really couldn't do a good job on the biennial report? This may be a hard push for them. Well, that's a good question. I know back in the day, sometimes we didn't get the biennial reports mailed back to us. We're going to put the pressure on them to fill out the assessment. Maybe having to do instead of a lighter touch, take a deeper dive in the compliance. We're thinking of ways to compel them to answer those questions. Many local governments have had severe budget and staffing cuts as a result of the pandemic. Does FEMA or will FEMA consider these issues in the CAV, and specifically when making a realistic assessment of what a community can do? Well, if I understand your question right, you're asking how will the strain of the pandemic on the resources affect the CAV assessments? Well, the regulations are still the regulations. And of course, every community who voluntarily participates in the NFIP must follow the regulations, and we must audit them and make sure that they're following those regulations. But as far as, you know, some timelines, if they're dreadfully understaffed and they need some extra time, that's always something that the state or the region can give when they're auditing. That's all the questions I see in my chat box. Sally, you got anything else for me?
Yes, we have a couple more. Will the community's grade have a relationship or impact on CRS rating?
Okay, so that's a great question, and we don't know the answer to that yet, since we're still in the redesigning phase. So we haven't built the prototype yet, but before we do, we're definitely going to coordinate with the CRS committee and the head of the CRS committee, Bill Lesser, and we're going to figure out these things like what would, if anything, the impact be of a compliance grade to the CRS program and their status.
Okay, that's all the questions right now. Is there anything, any question that we haven't asked that you normally get asked?
Well, let me think. Well, I do get asked, when can states make their comments and give their input and their feedback? And it's going to, what we're starting now, we started last week at the hazard mitigation workshop. And that's why I asked you those questions today at ASFPM. And we want to know what you think is working really well about CAVs and CACs now, what things are not working so well, and what we really need to keep. As we continue to build out this prototype and get it, put more flesh on the bones, then, and give you something more substantial to, you know, sling your arrows at, we will do that at some point in the future. Certainly, if not before then certainly you'll be hearing about it at the next ASFPM, the next hazard mitigation workshop.
Okay, Sarah, that's it. Thank you so much.
Oh, can I say one more thing? So if you have questions, please drop by our Floodplain Management Division booth here at the ASFPM. And also you can contact your regional person who's on the compliance committee, or you can contact me about feedback and questions about the CAV redesign, Sarah Owen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. We appreciate your time. Thank you. Okay, everybody, our second presentation is long-term substantial damage in South Carolina with Jessica Artz. Jessica is a flood mitigation specialist with the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources. She provides technical assistance to communities and participate in the National Flood Insurance Program in South Carolina, and she manages the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant. Jessica has been with the DNR since June of 2015. Take it away, Jessica.
Artz. I'm the flood mitigation specialist for South Carolina DNR. And today I'm going to talk about the long-term substantial damage program in South Carolina after Hurricane Florence. So in South Carolina, we have experienced quite a few floods over the past few years. Starting in 2015, we've had a federally declared disaster through 2018, and we've even had a few floods since 2018. So during these years, we've had a lot of experience doing substantial damage estimates and assisting communities with doing those substantial damage estimates. Just so we're all on the same page about what substantial damage is. Substantial damage is when there's been damage to a structure of any origin. So it could be a flood, fire, tornado, hurricane, and the cost to fix that damage is 50% or more of the market value of the structure. If a structure is deemed to be substantially damaged, it's automatically a substantial improvement. A substantial improvement is when there's been any sort of improvement to a structure. So that could be an addition, a renovation, anything like that. And if that improvement equals or exceeds 50% of the market value of the structure, then it's considered a substantial improvement. Substantial improvements are treated just like new construction. So that means that the structure will need to be brought into compliance with the current regulation. In South Carolina, we have cumulative substantial improvement. And while this is not a state law, we have this in our model ordinance, and the majority of communities have adopted this higher standard, which means that they track any damages or improvements to structures over a 5-year time period. And if those structures reach that 50% threshold within that 5 years, they have to be brought into compliance with the current regulations. So because of that cumulative substantial improvement clause, that means that communities, when they've had flooding or had a disaster, they typically have a lot of substantial damage assessments to do. So we have provided a lot of assistance over the years. We work very closely with our communities to help them do the substantial damage estimates. So we've coordinated volunteers, we've trained volunteers, we basically bring in people from wherever we can find them. We've used DNR staff, we've used the FEMA Corps, we've used the South Carolina State Guard, which is similar to the National Guard, but it's our state version. And then of course the local communities as much as possible. And what we've done in the past is we had this massive effort to do these substantial damage estimates with communities. And then once we are done with those estimates, we just leave. And then basically we're having to leave the community with that burden of managing those substantially damaged properties, which, as many of us know, can be a lot of effort and a lot of work. So that leaves it up to the communities to contact the homeowners, to issue all the permits, to work on rebuilding, applying for grants, and all of the other work that goes into recovering from a disaster. So what we found is that we didn't really know what was happening with these substantially damaged structures. We were going in and helping, making sure the community was in compliance with doing the estimates, but then not staying to make sure they were in compliance with actually regulating these structures the way they were supposed to be regulated. So what we were finding was that we would have compliance issues years down the road. Really, they would only be found when doing a community assistance visit. And as we all know, it's much harder to do anything about these compliance issues years later. A lot of times the homeowner has moved on, they've fixed their house, they've moved to a different house, they've sold their house, and these issues can be much more difficult to resolve. So FEMA had similar concerns and similar issues with long-term or with substantial damage. And so they developed the long-term substantial damage support program. And basically the goal of this program was to follow communities from the process of helping them do those substantial damage estimates all the way through compliance. So all the way until those structures that are identified as substantially damaged become compliant, and therefore the community becomes compliant with the program. They began a pilot program in Florida as a response to some of these compliance issues. And then it was shortly after they began that pilot program in Florida, Hurricane Florence came and hit in South Carolina and in North Carolina. So Hurricane Florence made landfall on September 14th, 2018 as Category 1. And even though this was only a Category 1 event, it was still a major flood event for our state. We had major flooding impacts that lasted for several weeks, where water was in people's homes for several weeks. We knew that this was going to be a pretty massive substantial damage estimate effort. So we coordinated volunteers from the state, from FEMA, and from local communities. Together, we conducted over 1,300 substantial damage estimates and found over 300 substantially damaged structures identified. As we were going through this process of helping communities to do these substantial damage estimates, FEMA requested permission from the state to implement the long-term substantial damage program in South Carolina. And so what that meant is that of the disaster staff that came after the event, that 4 additional staff would stay in South Carolina for several months. And FEMA and the state identified 44 communities to participate in the long-term substantial damage program. And we decided that 6 of those would be better served to be managed by the state for various reasons. Some of those communities were ones that we had already built good relationships with, or we were very familiar with their flooding issues, or we just thought they might be more receptive to the state. So we managed 6 of them, and FEMA managed the rest of the communities. And then we coordinated monthly, at least monthly calls to talk about the status of all of those communities. So the way that the program works is basically it's set up in different phases. So phase 1 of the program is identifying the communities for contact. So basically using the data and the resources that we had, we identified which communities were impacted by the flood event. And of those communities, we delivered a joint letter. So that letter was signed by the state coordinator and it was signed by FEMA. And in the letter, we basically just explained that we were going to be reaching out to these communities. We were going to be going over their substantial damage program. And then we listed out the types of support that we would be offering to the communities. We sent out 3 letters, and if they didn't reach back to us with 1 letter, we sent them a second letter. If they didn't reach back to us again, we sent them a 3rd letter, and then eventually FEMA would just show up at their office. So, but in response to the letters, FEMA was trying to coordinate a time to go visit these communities and do a general technical assistance, a GTA. And these GTAs were very helpful because FEMA used a set form that had very specific questions on there, such as, how familiar are you with your substantial damage program? Did you have damaged structures in the special flood hazard area? How many of those structures were substantially damaged? So we had a lot of really good information that was gathered from these communities. All of these GTA forms were then put into CIS, the Community Information System, so we had access to them all. And it was very helpful from the state's perspective because then we were able to see if we needed to go back to some of these communities to assist them further in doing their substantial damage estimates. So once these communities had these GTAs, then they were identified for further support, depending on how they responded to these GTAs. So the communities were divided up into different tiers, depending on the level of support that they needed. So a tier 3 community, for example, needed a low level of support because they had minimal substantial damage structures. They had a substantial damage process that was documented, and they had their inspections completed. So they did not need as much support. A tier 2 community had a substantial damage process, but perhaps had a lot of substantially damaged structures. And so their support would be just working through them on the tracking and documenting those substantially damaged structures through compliance. And then a tier 1 community would need a high level of support, and those were ones that were identified as having no substantial damage process, limited substantial damage actions taken, potential deficiencies were identified. So those were ones that needed a high level of support. Once these communities were identified and the ones that had substantially damaged structures, were asked to complete these field tracker forms. It might be kind of hard to see these forms, but basically they're just an Excel spreadsheet with some basic information about the structure, about the damage, and then how they're being brought into compliance. And the idea was that the communities would fill these forms out on a regular basis, keep them updated, and then send those forms to FEMA or the state on a regular basis, so we could sort of track what's been brought into compliance and what's remaining. And then phase 3 was just continuing that documenting and that support process, maintaining contact with communities and continuing to receive that field tracker form and determine which structures have been brought into compliance. So some of our successes and challenges with this program in South Carolina, I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenges first. And I'd say our number one concern throughout the whole process was a lack of flexibility with the program. There were 44 communities that were identified based on that tiered system, yet only 9 of those communities had substantially damaged structures. So we were spending a lot of time focusing on communities that had no substantially damaged structures. But because they sort of fit into that tier 3 high level of support needed, because perhaps they didn't really have a substantial damage program, or they couldn't document their substantial damage program, they were identified as needing a high level of support, even though they didn't have substantially damaged structures. So I think we started to sort of get into a mix of, is this a compliance program or is this a training and outreach program? And I think we were sort of trying to force some communities into a training and outreach program when perhaps it wasn't the best time to do that. They still had other flooding issues that they were dealing with, or they perhaps felt that this training was being a little bit forced on them. I think the effort really should have been on the communities with substantially damaged structures and bringing those structures into compliance. And sort of with that is that a lot of the phases and the tiers and the tracking sheets that were created as part of this program didn't always fit into what was going on with the communities. That, an example of the tiered community that is based on the tiers needs a high level of support, yet has no substantially damaged structures. Well, that seems like that should be for a separate time, a separate program, and we should stay focused on the substantially damaged structures. The phases were not always clear, as well as what phase we were in and what needed to happen in which phase. And it wasn't necessarily, that was more, I guess, of an internal process that FEMA developed in order to apply this program nationwide, which I understand that they need. But it didn't always apply well on the ground in these specific communities. The tracking sheets, for example, a lot of communities had their own way of tracking these structures. And so there were situations where, why can't we just use their tracking sheets? Why do they have to have their own tracking sheets and then they have to fill out our tracking sheets as well? So just adding some flexibility into the program to help cater to the needs and the realities of the community was a challenge. And sometimes it felt like a major burden to communities because there was so much communication with the communities and so many things that we were trying to push communities to do, like fill out these tracking sheets and give us all this extra information and meet with us on a regular basis and attend these trainings and these special sessions. And I think some of the communities got kind of burnt out. They were already dealing with a disaster and a flood, and then they were having to deal with FEMA and the state constantly coming to them, asking them more questions and asking them a lot of times the same information over and over again. And then one of the big challenges that we had with the program was kind of a lack of follow through at the very end. We started out strong, reaching out to these communities, getting them to fill out these tracker sheets, doing everything we can, really probably over communicating with these communities, only to, in the end, it just sort of fizzled out. The FEMA staff that were here in South Carolina left, and then, you know, our staff at the state was having to get back on track after just dealing with a major disaster. The FEMA, our state FEMA representative had, you know, her job to get to, and there really wasn't anybody that was keeping the program running and following through to the end to really make sure that these structures were brought into compliance. So I felt like in the end, we were sort of left back where we started, where we're just going to have to figure out in the next CAV what's happened with all of these structures. However, that being said, I do think that one of our successes is more and better implementation of substantial damage requirements statewide. Since Florence, all the CAVs that I have done, I really haven't come across any major substantial damage issues. Most of the communities have done their substantial damage estimates, and so far haven't seen any structures that are currently not in compliance. So still have some communities remaining to do, and there's still time to figure out, you know, if everybody did what they were supposed to do. But I definitely think there's been a lot more awareness of substantial damage estimates and the compliance issues that follow. I think the coordination with FEMA was a success. It's always better when we can coordinate and work together. You know, we are a pretty tight-knit state and pretty involved with our communities. And so we'd like to know when FEMA's going into communities and what they're trying to do. And it works better when we're doing that together. And FEMA was very receptive to our what we wanted to do and how we wanted to communicate with those communities. Like I mentioned before, so far, I think we're seeing less compliance issues, and I hope that that trend continues as we continue to do CAVs. And definitely, I think there's been a increased awareness of recovery resources and challenges that communities face after a CAV. I'm sorry, after a disaster. So some of the recommendations that I would have would be one, to allow more time between contacts. I know after speaking with some communities after this process, they really felt like they were, I don't want to say the word harassed, but people were trying to get information out of them on a very, very regular basis. And they just didn't have enough time to accomplish the things that FEMA and the state were asking them to accomplish. They were still in recovery mode. They have a lot going on after that. And so they really just needed some more time. And, you know, FEMA had extra staff here, staying here, and they were probably in a hurry to wrap this program up and get going. And so they had a lot of time to try and communicate with these communities and to reach out to these communities. And they probably weren't seeing the progress they wanted to see on their end, and communities just weren't able to keep up with the amount of requested information that FEMA and the state was asking for. I do think there needs to be more flexibility into the program, as I mentioned before, not only in the ways and frequency of communication, but also perhaps with the tracking methods, maybe catering more to how communities are tracking and what it is they're doing. So how can we help them with their compliance issues without being a burden to them? Because if we become a burden to the community, then they're going to be less likely to communicate with us and to keep that door open for discussion of those compliance issues. So with that, I think that is the end of my presentation, and I'll be available for questions. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. We're back. That was great information, Jessica. Thank you so much. We're just going to let you dive right into the questions. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks everybody. I see a few questions here. The first question, which is a few questions in one, how much time was allowed for a property owner to bring a structure into compliance? At what point does FEMA consider non-compliance for the community for enforcing substantial damage? What time intervals were the substantial damage letter and reminder letters sent, and what was the frequency of follow-up inspections, if any? And I would say a lot of this stuff really varied by community. Obviously, there were communities that have more resources and more staff are able to do a little bit more follow-up and reach out to property owners a little more often. So there wasn't any real set timeline for these things. And perhaps that's something that we could work towards with developing this long-term substantial damage program, especially at least with recommendations for timeframes. And then at what point does FEMA consider non-compliance for the community for enforcing substantial damage? And that's a really good question. And I don't know that there is any set time frame. Again, I think that's something that probably just comes up in a CAV, and then it will get addressed in a CAV if it's not in compliance by the time that CAV is done. But something to definitely to think about for the future. The second question, how many or percent of the substantial damage properties were able to receive FEMA mitigation funding, such as HMGP or FMA? Another really great question, perhaps something that we should do a better job of tracking. There's a few years lag time between an actual event when something's determined to be substantial damage and when it gets get grant funding. So I don't know that there's anybody that's really tracking that information very well. So that's a good suggestion for tracking in the future. Did the state reach out to other communities on the west side of the state without damage to assist with inspections, especially communities with trained personnel? And yes, that is something that we've been working on doing more and more as we've had so many events over the past few years. We've actually developed a substantial damage volunteer network. Unfortunately, COVID's kind of halted it all, and we didn't have a major event this year. But the idea is that we have communities that join this volunteer network. They sign a letter saying that they're committing to a certain amount of time to volunteer. They get permission from their supervisors. They agree to do a training to provide their own transportation. And so we've had a few different communities commit to that. And we were hoping to expand on that and then, reach out and provide some more trainings. The idea is that we provide at least a training every year on substantial damage estimates and kind of keep those volunteers trained in the case that they need to go out into the field. And the next question, could we get copies of the forms you developed to use in assessing the help needed in the SDE process? I'm interested in GTA questions asked of the community. I would imagine that's something I can share. That was a FEMA form that was used for each community. I'm not exactly sure how I could get that out to everybody, but that's something that we can look into. How much easier would the substantial damage compliance process be if the HMA grant process could be sped up, especially since substantially damaged structures are automatically cost effective for the mitigation grant programs? Yes, that would be much easier if there was grant funds that were available faster. We do see a lot of people use ICC funds, and those are available much sooner than grants are. So those tend to be used quite often. And unfortunately, when you have events, we had events over so many years, people were flooding again before they could ever get a grant to fix their current problem. So we were seeing structures that were substantially damaged that were flooding over again, or they were substantially damaged because they became cumulatively substantially damaged. So yes, speeding up that grant process would definitely make that easier. Were any of these 44 communities placed on probation or suspension as a result of your long-term substantial damage review follow-ups. Did any of these communities lose CRS ratings or gain CRS rating as a result of long-term substantial damage follow-up reviews? No, nobody was placed on probation or suspension. For those of you that deal with CACs and CADs on a regular basis, you probably know it takes quite a bit for a community to be placed on probation or suspension. It takes a long time. And as I mentioned at the presentation, unfortunately, the follow-ups sort of dwindled more than we would have liked. So we've sort of, just transitioned into the CAV process, and that's really where we have a little bit more of a stick. I'd be curious to know if Florida or other states where they've done the long-term substantial damage program, if they have had any communities that have been put on probation or suspension as a result of this. We never fully got to that part of the process. So. Not having building codes, how would you recommend tracking cumulative substantial damage with limited information submitted in the past? Typically, substantial damage or substantial improvement, the cumulative part of it is tracked. If it's a substantial improvement, it's tracked through the permitting process, which that should be happening even if there aren't building codes. They still should be getting floodplain permits. And then you can begin tracking those improvements. And also even if there's not building codes, the community should still be doing substantial damage estimates. So that should still be tracked from the past. And, the idea is that if you do that over every time, then you keep a record of that, then you're not necessarily digging back, looking for past information. You're just tracking that as you go over the 5-year time period or whatever your time period may be. Consistent and complete contractor estimates were an issue in Nebraska. We created a uniform contractor estimate form to ensure all SDE calculated work was included in the estimate. Do you include a similar form? No, we have not done that, but that's a great idea. It is definitely challenging. And we just sort of put that on the community to say, be sure and look at that contractor estimate, compare it to your SDE, and make sure that the similar information is being captured there. So, and that's just left up to the community to make that determination. But that is a good idea. My questions are moving around, so I hope I'm not missing anything here. How might FEMA and other emergency response agencies better coordinate their community outreach mandates so that local officials are not overwhelmed and frustrated by too much helpful government during the community's disaster response services? Yeah, I mean, this is a challenge on all fronts. The amount of inspections that homeowners receive after there's been a disaster is probably quite overwhelming. And local officials, as we all know, are being pulled in a million different directions after a disaster. And that's one reason that I really think that this program needs some flexibility to work with the communities to try and figure out what works best for them, instead of us just telling them this is exactly what they need to do and when, that we try to incorporate the information that we need into their current practices and data gathering that they're doing. That could make it a little more challenging on our end, but it might help us to get more streamlined information from the community. Projects such as septic system replacement, pools, accessory structures, vehicles, storage still need to comply with standards laid out for overall loss prevention. How can the municipality convey the simplest improvements and projects add up to equal larger mitigation efforts? That's a challenging question. Yeah, I think that's more of a bigger big picture question and a bigger issue to resolve with overall flood mitigation rather than the specific substantial damage estimate, but definitely something important to consider. Did it come across to some communities like FEMA didn't trust them? I would say it probably did. There were situations where FEMA might have had data that they had gathered that, maps and inundation maps and areas that showed where, according to their data, the area should have flooded. But the community would say to them, well, no house is flooded, no structure's flooded. However, it sometimes seemed like the FEMA didn't believe what the communities were telling them because they had a map that showed otherwise. It's hard to know exactly who's telling the truth. I understand that, but I definitely think it came across that way as FEMA didn't always believe, especially these smaller, there were a lot of really small rural towns that it may be hard to get good information from. Wow, you guys have lots of great questions. All right, I see one that says, what are ICC funds? I'm sorry, I used that acronym. That's increased cost of compliance funds. Those are available to anyone that has a flood insurance policy and they're deemed substantially damaged. It's funds that they can access to bring their structure into compliance. It's up to $30,000 to bring their structure into compliance. Is 5 years a reasonable cumulative substantial damage period? My experience has been with a community that uses a 10-year period, pros and cons. I don't know that I have a lot to say about that. 5 years has been the number that we've gone with our model ordinance. That's what most communities have. I could definitely see the benefit of 10 years, especially since, the long-term changes that we're seeing with flood events and increased flood events. I know of one community that had lifetime of structure, and that's the most stringent one that I've seen. But I think it really depends on community. Some communities really struggle with the cumulative because it makes it hard for homeowners to do things to their homes. And so having a 5-year time period sort of gives them a chance to have an opportunity to work on their homes and to do maybe things that they want to do to their home. But I think there's pros and cons to both. Can you use your own SDE form if they are close to the FEMA forms? I think this is probably gonna be our last question. And absolutely, we in South Carolina have developed our own SDE process and we have our own form. We found the FEMA forms to be a little bit overwhelming and time consuming, and we've completely moved away from the SDE app that FEMA uses, and we've created our own way of gathering that information. So yes, I think as long as it meets the intent and the standards that FEMA has established, that you can use your own form. And I'd be happy to talk to anybody offline about that as well.
Great, Jessica. We really appreciate your time and giving us this presentation and all this information. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Bye. Okay, everybody, our third and last presentation is FEMA's new direction on NFIP ESA compliance with Bret Gates. Bret is the NFIP ESA coordinator in FEMA's Floodplain Management Division, Mitigation Directorate, Federal Insurance and Mitigation Administration. What a title, Bret. He is currently responsible for national NFIP ESA coordination, floodplain management policy, and special projects. Go ahead, Bret.
Thank you for joining us today for this update on FEMA's new direction on the NFIP Endangered Species Act compliance planning. I'm Bret Gates, FEMA's National ESA Coordinator. This map depicts the NFIP ESA consultations conducted in blue and the ones currently in process in yellow. While FEMA's position has been that private floodplain development is not a FEMA action for purposes of the ESA, NFIP and ESA compliance has been a long-standing issue dating back to 1994 Key Deer court case in Florida, which required FEMA to consult under the ESA on implementation of the NFIP. FEMA has either lost or settled these lawsuits, agreeing to consult in Arizona, Florida, New Mexico, Oregon, the Puget Sound, and various counties, and now statewide in California. FEMA reached a not likely to adversely affect ESA determination in Arizona and New Mexico, requiring only minor program changes to the NFIP for ESA compliance. However, also through these consultations, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service, that I'll refer to from now on as the services, have issued 3 jeopardy opinions. These are for Monroe County, Florida, Puget Sound, Washington, and in Oregon. These required significant NFIP changes to be implemented. This is because when you receive a jeopardy opinion from the services, FEMA must do everything in its power to implement reasonable and prudent alternatives, or RPAs as they're called, from these jeopardy opinions that allow the species to recover. FEMA is implementing these RPAs in a manner that is consistent with the NFIP legal authorities in Monroe County and in Puget Sound. However, given the prescriptive nature of the Oregon RPAs essentially stopping floodplain development, FEMA is working closely with all stakeholders to develop an implementation plan that is legally implementable by FEMA and the Oregon communities. FEMA has been challenged through ESA consultations to agree upon what actions must be analyzed as part of the implementation of the NFIP, since the NFIP has no direct actions or approvals for private floodplain development. For instance, what is the measurable role of flood insurance availability on private floodplain development or on community permitting process? Another challenge is that the NFIP has a statutory requirement to establish a unified program for floodplain management, which means that the NFIP must be administered the same in each participating community and in each state. However, FEMA's view of a uniform NFIP has been severely challenged by these individual state or area-specific consultations, which are all unique, resulting in differing outcomes, and an NFIP managed inconsistently in each of the ESA consultation locations. FEMA attempted to address these issues nationally by completing a National Biological Evaluation, or BE, on the NFIP in 2016, in which we determined that the implementation of the NFIP had no effect on species under the Endangered Species Act. Further, under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, FEMA produced our National Programmatic Environmental Impact Statement, or NPEIS, on the NFIP, which analyzed the resource area impacts based on NFIP program changes. These were determined to be either less than significant or less than significant with beneficial effects, for instance, the CRS. The Record of Decision, or ROD, was published in 2018 with the decision to implement the following NFIP program changes to demonstrate compliance with the ESA, and it identified opportunities for the NFIP to further conservation under Section 7A1 of the Endangered Species Act. This busy slide identifies the NFIP Record of Decision program changes. The NFIP had moved forward on the insurance-related changes in the Record of Decision. So let's focus today on the proposed changes, or at least then proposed changes, in red. Item D is a proposed policy clarification that, pursuant to NFIP minimum standards under 60.3A2, a community must obtain and maintain documentation of compliance with appropriate federal or state laws, including the ESA, as the condition of issuing floodplain development permits. And under item E, proposed policy clarification says that issuing of certain letters of map change, or LOMACs, these requests are contingent on the community or the project proponent on the community's behalf submitting documentation of compliance with the ESA. You may remember in 2019 at the Cleveland ASFPM annual meeting, During multiple sessions, I explained that FEMA's next steps were to determine what ESA compliance documentation looked like. And once that was determined, we would issue a policy clarifying that all NFIP participating communities must determine a process for ESA compliance and document that compliance for future community assistance visits or CAVs. Based on the most recent California ESA lawsuit and challenge to the NFIP's biological evaluation, FEMA has paused implementation of these two ESA-related NFIP changes in favor of starting a new ESA consultation with the services, which I'll explain a little later on. Section 7A1 of the ESA emphasizes that agencies should utilize their existing authorities to carry out programs for the conservation of endangered and threatened species. The ESA Section 7A1 consultation process is different in many ways from the Section 7A2, and there are no regulatory timelines. There's fewer legal challenges. This process is often less contentious, and it's certainly more collaborative, as we have certainly found out in our 3 years of collegial meetings with the services. As part of the NPIS Record of Decision, or ROD, FEMA needed to address concerns related to ESA compliance. Our first step was to form an interagency NFIP ESA Section 7A1 work group, which included monthly representation from the services. The goal of the work group was to help FEMA develop and carry out a program for the conservation of endangered and threatened species under the ESA. The work group identified 3 key components as part of the NFIP Section 7A1 Conservation Action Program: building awareness through a conservation website, helping with identification using the FRESH mapping tool, and promoting existing incentives and creating new incentives through the CRS for conservation of federally listed species and their designated habitat. For those of you that just heard this prior in session A1 with French Wetmore and myself, please have a little patience as I re-explain it, but hopefully more briefly. The first component was to build awareness in communities of the benefits of threatened and endangered species and habitat conservation through an NFIP Floodplains and Wildlife Conservation webpage. The webpage provides ESA education and awareness to communities about opportunities for reducing flood risk and lowering flood insurance premiums while conserving essential habitat for ESA-listed threatened and endangered species. The webpage also is found at FEMA.gov, and it's shown on the link here. Also includes several web pages and provides background information as to why it is important to protect natural floodplains, and also includes examples from communities around the country that you may be familiar with. The second component is helping communities identify floodplains where ESA-listed species may be present. FEMA developed the Flood Risk and Endangered Species Habitat, or FRESH, FRESH, which is a web-based mapping tool, and it's available online via the link you see on the slide. FRESH can be used as a planning tool to aid NFIP participating communities with the integration of species conservation activities into their floodplain management programs, as it provides the special flood hazard layer as well as ESA information all in one place. The user can search an address in their community or look for the whole community's boundaries, and the tool will identify threatened and endangered species that have a range within the selected search area. The third component was to find ways to incentivize CRS communities to undertake activities that protect ESA-listed species and habitat. Through a pilot study, FEMA interviewed 36 CRS communities around the country, each having a substantial number of ESA species. The findings specifically led to changes in the January CRS Coordinator's Manual Addendum that expands natural floodplain functions credit in Section 512. CRS communities can now receive credit for conducting a floodplain species assessment, or FSA, and receive 15 points, and or doing a floodplain species plan, FSP, and receive an additional 85 points. FEMA hopes the CRS community will pursue creating a floodplain species plan, leveraging the information from the floodplain species assessment and relative species recovery plans and subject matter expert feedback. Both reports are provided to experts at the services, FEMA, and other environmental organizations for feedback. Information and training on these new CRS sub-elements is provided quarterly via crsresources.org. And the next training webinar on this matter is scheduled for June 16th. So what are our next steps? We're using the ESA compliance process to bring about a new focus. NFIP ESA compliance is to further the conservation of protected species and their critical habitats by encouraging FEMA flood risk mitigation priorities that promote the creation, maintenance, and preservation of naturally functioning floodplains to reduce flood losses. Floodplains, protected species, residents, and businesses can all benefit from the improved protection of natural floodplain functions. What is good for protected wildlife and floodplains is often good for hazard reduction and community resilience. Healthy floodplains reduce overall risk, loss of life, and benefit endangered and threatened species. The NFIP ESA Section 7A1 Conservation Action Program provides opportunities and benefits for reducing flood risk and lowering flood insurance premiums while conserving threatened and endangered species habitat by engaging in CRS activities for communities to earn credits for their species conservation efforts. And with this new focus, FEMA has started a new NFIP ESA Section 7A2 consultation that will identify the activities and potential impacts to species and their habitat resulting from NFIP-related activities. By conducting the new consultation, FEMA, working with the services, will be able to identify conservation measures that lead to changes to the NFIP, which benefit protected species and their habitat, and that reduce community flood risk. Excuse me. For our next steps, FEMA is actively working with the services to sign an MOU supporting the Conservation Action Program. FEMA and the services plan to meet regularly to conduct adaptive management reviews of the Section 7A1 NFIP Conservation Action Program. The goal of the pre-coordination meetings with the services is to determine a mutual overall framework for the national Section 7A2 consultation. Ultimately, we hope to complete a Section 7A2 consultation that allows us to fold in the ESA cheese, as it were, forgive me, Schitt's Creek fans, that is to wrap up in the existing state-specific consultations that I mentioned before in my presentation, and it allows FEMA to standardize our ESA compliance program consistently across all NFIP participating communities. We would then update, as necessary, our earlier biological evaluation and the NFIP and NPEIS through the NEPA process to reflect the outcome of this national consultation. As the process unfolds, FEMA plans to offer forums with you, our NFIP stakeholders, for you to offer recommendations and input for possible program changes necessary to demonstrate ESA species conservation and compliance. So while ESA changes to the NFIP are not here for communities to implement today, they are on the horizon and they are coming. You will get the opportunity to participate at various stops in the process. So I'll take questions now, and I just wanted to stop on this slide to show you some of the links that we had before that I talked about. The Floodplains and Wildlife Conservation webpage is shown first. The fresh mapping tool, and we have a user's guide, are at the second link. And finally, we have the Floodplain Species Assessment, FSA, and Floodplain Species Plan, FSP, guidance at the third link. I thank you for your time today and glad to answer questions.
Well, thank you, Bret. That was a whole lot of information in a very short amount of time. So let's jump right into the questions.
Great.
Are you ready?
I am.
Okay, is FEMA still in consultation with the services in Florida concerning impacts of the NFIP on the 5 species of sea turtles?
No, FEMA's not. We completed that consultation several years ago.
Okay. Next question, how will this new consultation process 7A2 impact the Oregon BIOP implementation plan?
These are actually, the national consultation is on a separate track. We just started what we call our pre-coordination meetings, where we're just working with National Marine Fisheries and U.S. Fish and Wildlife just to start the ball rolling and figure out how the process is going to work. We would expect it to be many months, if not even a year or two. And they're on, probably worried right now that I said that. But that process is separate. In Oregon, we had a process where a jeopardy determination was made, of course, against NFIP, and we are working with our stakeholders trying to develop a implementation plan that all communities in the state can follow, as well as the state and well as FEMA. So that is on a separate process, and it's a faster track, we hope. And that ultimately, as I kind of said, it would be in a perfect world, all of these separate consultations would end up being, as I said, folded into the national at a later time. But we have no idea where the national is going at this point, since we're at the first step or two of the process. So we have to, of course, follow through with the Oregon first.
Okay. What can the Community Floodplain Management Program do to prepare for these changes?
I think, well, number one is we already have in the our regulations, right, that all communities have to be in compliance with all other federal and state laws as they go through and process permits. But obviously we assume and hope that everyone has a very robust Endangered Species Act review program already in place. And as we talked about it through this process, we don't know how we currently are going, have asked communities to document what they're doing. They have to do something. Everybody must comply with the Endangered Species Act, so that you have to have some kind of process in place as you go through and issue permits and do these reviews, so that you can guarantee under the Endangered Species Act you're not harming species, and eventually, of course, or have a take under Section 9. So it will be a difference from the current document what you're doing and tell us about your process of compliance to to something probably more robust and protective and that would conserve species and critical habitat. So I think most communities already have something in place, but they could start maybe by looking at our website. And I've asked someone in our team to put that website on the web, so that you can see it. And then that would be a logical place to start to see where we are with our current program, and then to spread off from there. But it's going to be a process that we're going to work with our stakeholders through. As we promised, we're going to have webinars and we're going to have listening sessions and things coming in the months ahead as we learn more about what things may change with the program. So stay tuned is what I could say to these listening sessions, and we'll be contacting you.
So Bret, what web page would they go to access this information?
I left it in the slides, but of course the slides don't still show up now in the virtual setting. And hopefully you could Google it, but it's our conservation under FEMA.gov. It's our conservation webpage. And so I think Jen Salerno on our team will, if it's not up now, I'll ask her to paste it in the questions so that people can look at that.
Okay. Generally, where would you say have been the most difficult to resolve conflicts in this area? Has it been the mapping extent of habitat area?
I would say that for FEMA, the most difficult thing is we have, no say over private development. We don't know when permits are issued or not issued. We of course, the minimum regs that you have to issue a permit and follow the minimum regs, but we're not aware of what's going on. And day to day, and until we do a compliance visit, and this session was talking about some of the calves and whatnot. So it's one of the hardest things is we know we have an influence and impact on species and habitat. And lots of times we think it's positive through programs like the CRS and the conservation efforts there and the new points you heard about. But there are other influences. What is the influences I said earlier in the slides about the fact that we have insurance? Does that, 10 people decide not to build in a floodplain, but one does because they want that insurance? That's a consequence that I know we understand we have to work with, but how do we measure that? And that's one of the toughest things, I think, from a program standpoint, that we're looking for the services to help us as we go through this consultation.
Okay. And I believe this might be our last question. What is FEMA's timeline for stakeholder engagement, and how can ASFPM help facilitate the feedback?
We're working on the approval process right now for what that looks like. I know like the CRS transformation came up and that they're going to use a website and they're going to use listening sessions, for instance. We know we're definitely going to do that. We're not sure if we're going to use the Federal Register and go that way, or it's just going to be more interactive, kind of maybe something similar to what Bret has done in the past, where they had a lot of listening sessions and had questions out there for stakeholders. So we're still working that out, but so I apologize that we don't have anything unveiled right now today to tell you, but it is coming, and we'll be reaching out to everyone and definitely working with the association to make sure that that all of the members understand where we're going, or at least have an ability to factor in and let us know and inform us as we move along.
Okay, that's it. That wraps us up. Bret, thank you very much for your time and all the information you provided us. That's a lot to take in. We did put up the links in the questions box if anybody wants to take a quick picture of that. So that's there.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much, everybody. You have a great day. Appreciate you coming to this session. Bye.